Richard Ackland is in the blue shirt and the dark glasses over there, dark framed glasses. I first met Richard when I was a baby lawyer at Fitzroy Legal Service 1,000,000 years ago. He was then already an esteemed commentator on media and the law, and one of the very first, one of the pioneers of that overlap between the two different professions. He publishes Justinian. He also contributes the best gossip column you could ever read on Saturdays in the Saturday paper under the title of Gadfly. And if you're not already making it the first thing you read on your weekend newspaper hunt, you should. I recommend it. He also worked at the ABC for many years, presenting both Late Night Live and Radio National Breakfast.
Well, thanks everybody, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I hope you can hear me because I can't hear a thing sitting there. It's just sort of this wonderful gilded room that looks as though Donald Trump has been designing it. Just the acoustics are weird. But look, I've always thought this expression, freedom of the press, freedom of the media, was a very self-indulgent notion. I mean, I would prefer something like, you know, be nice to journalists, or answer their phone calls, or, you know, give them some information. But freedom of the press implies that there should be special freedoms that maybe other people don't have. And when you consider the idea of a newspaper, this product that comes out every day, and I've forgotten who described it in these terms, but it is this imperfect assembly of news and information and commentary and photos and advertising, all decided by editors who are making imperfect choices. What to leave out is just as important as what to put in. Then it's all got to fit, and the fitting of it is determined by the volume of advertising that's paying for the wretched thing. And this is then put on dead trees, on presses, and put on trucks and delivered around the place, and then you go home and you wake up and you come in next day and you do it all again. And there's always that expectation that the next day it'll be a more perfect product, it'll be a better newspaper, but it never is perfect. It's a percentage game, journalism. It's a percentage of what you can capture in that moment and deliver. There used to be, you know, the old rather cynical saying, you know, a free press for those who own one. That meant people that had $600 million that could afford to buy a printing press, and another $200 million to set up an organisation to print papers. Well, now the barriers to entry have virtually disappeared. Everyone can be a publisher on their phones. And this has altered the entire equation about what the media is and what the definition is and who we are and are we really journalists. And there are all these citizen journalists springing out with their opinions and conspiracy theories and nutty notions, and it's all swamping us. So what this discussion is about, I think, is about a media that is well curated, well researched, and professional. And that is what, as John says, a democracy needs, because we take it for granted that there are, you know, the main democratic institutions are elected politicians, the executive government of the nation, the independent courts, but the media does have a vital role in holding, you know, the political process, the corporate process, the artistic community, every endeavour of life to account. I mean, you just got to think for 40 seconds what the Morrison government would be like if there were no newspapers. They would just, you know, it'd just be a riot. They would just roll right over the top of this country. At least the newspapers are, and other media too, are doing something of a job to hold government, politicians, corporates to account. Now the problem is that capacity to do that job is shrinking all the time. You can see it with national security laws, where Annika has rubbed up a fairly close personal experience with them, with defamation, with sources. I mean, the whole lifeblood of information depends on sources. And we saw today the federal court, which, part of me thinks is an abomination. They've struck down the ABC's challenge to the warrant that, they raided the ABC back in June. The federal police raided the ABC back in June. It may have been July, but I think it was June. Took away hundreds of documents in relation to stories about the role of the Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. This was a story that no one has ever said was incorrect or was wrong or had been over-gilded. It was also a story where the source for some of that information was already publicly known. So you just wonder what the police are doing, trampling into the national broadcaster, seizing documents. It was nothing more than an attempted intimidation at not only the journalists, but the sources of journalists. And now, last year, there were some amendments to the secrecy provisions in Australia, which until then had been fairly relaxed, but it's criminalised government whistleblowers and criminalised journalists for reporting what government whistleblowers provide to them. So this has led to a very chilling effect, an uncertainty, really. Someone comes in with a hot story about some malfeasance in the government. The lawyers in the newspaper or the television station look at it and say, oh, we don't know, this could be in breach of the National Security Act, or this could be in breach of the ASIO Act. We don't know if this is a special ASIO operation, which we can't report at all. We can't report certain court proceedings at all. So the result of that sort of uncertainty is a chilling effect. The decision inevitably is don't publish it. It's better to put another mushroom omelette recipe in the paper than actually report something that's in the public interest. Anyway, that'll do for the moment. Thank you.
There are proceedings that have mostly been dropped, but I'm not sure if any of your colleagues are still under fire over breaching the suppression orders on George Pell's trial.
Yeah, they dropped a bunch of them last week.
They dropped a bunch, but they dropped 105, but Richard probably knows, I think there's still about 100 still on foot, including against foreign entities, which raises the fascinating question whether or not Peter Kidd, the Chief Judge of the County Court of Victoria, can enforce contempt proceedings against Facebook or the New York Times. And how does he imprison the editor of the New York Times if he's so minded? Richard.
Yeah, some charges were dropped earlier last week, some extra ones. So I'm not sure now how many editors and proprietors and publishing companies are actually defendants in that case, but it's the criticism I saw from the judge in the last round was that he was very upset that the DPP hadn't got its act together and actually provided the defendants with some thorough information about what the charge is and what the details are.
That was Johnny Dixon in the Supreme Court in Victoria.
Dixon, yes.
Yes, and Peter Kidd, who is the Chief Judge of the County Court, who, I'm not sure this has ever been published. Have you seen the transcript? When he called Kerry Judd, the DPP, and Robert Rickard before him to discuss what he said were the most blatant breaches of suppression orders any of them had ever seen. And he basically says, if I had a guillotine in the courtyard behind the court, I'd use it this afternoon, and not for the purpose of cutting up paper either, I should say. He was furious, and he made his fury absolutely clear if you read the transcript of those proceedings. It's hilarious. You rarely hear a judge being so angry.
I did read the transcript, and I think it was going around on the internet a bit. But in
fact, he says, I know I shouldn't be on the bench when I'm this angry, but I'm staying here for this hearing.
I mean, it just sort of shows this sort of weird netherworld where none of the allegedly offending media organisations mentioned the word Pell.
Yep.
And so it's this sort of guessing game. Did people guess that this headline that says big trial decision has been handed down that we can't tell you? Did people automatically switch their brain onto the word Pell? This is a whole lot of guesswork that you think, a criminal court's not going to sort of contend with very comfortably. So the other thing, of course, is that this suppression order had a sort of mythical quality about it because it was put in place because there was meant to be a second trial for Pell. That second trial was called off, so therefore there was no absolute need for a suppression order on the result of the first trial. It does strike me as a bit of overreach by the DPP to keep chasing this and spending a lot of resources and time when they could be doing some proper criminal work.
And these raids are almost operatic in scale, and it's hard to escape leaping to the conclusion that they're entirely designed to be theatrical and a public demonstration of power rather than trying to solve a crime, because the crime has been solved.
Well, they don't, they quite like raiding journalists, but the AFP has a distinct dislike of investigating people like Angus Taylor for fraudulently manipulating documents from his office with his signature on them that he sent to the Daily Telegraph. So you just wonder what the sort of priorities are.
We don't wonder.
I mean, it wasn't even, they decided not even to investigate the complaint about Taylor. It wasn't that they investigated it and found there wasn't an offence. They didn't want to investigate it. They didn't investigate it because he apologised.
The contrast between the religious freedom campaign compared to free speech or media freedom campaign, which one occupies more of the so-called culture war? I mean, it's extraordinary. Richard, you write about this in your Saturday paper column from time to time.
It's just a mess, the Religious Freedom Bill. Chaotic, the churches want more, the civil liberty organisations see it as an avenue for vile remarks and discrimination to be made on the basis of religious or faith belief. And, Porter's got himself, the Attorney General, into a terrible mess trying to reconcile these two things. It's completely unreconcilable. There doesn't really need to be any more religious freedom. It's perfectly fine as it is. This is a Morrison thing to, scratch his fleas off with his Pentecostal mates, and it's ridiculous. I'm glad everyone agrees. But on the issue of the right to know that you were talking about, I think this is very interesting because, it wasn't always this sort of unanimous voice within the media about right to know. I can well remember, when the Fairfax papers, The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Financial Review got into trouble in the courts or they were raided or there was a defamation action that they lost. Particularly the Australian would be gleeful. It would be attacking them. This is, these silly mugs, look what they've done. It's a mess and they've made mistakes. I think the unanimity came about as a result of the raid on Annika, and News Corp joined the fold and has been party to a more unified voice. So Annika is the glue in the Right to Know organisation.
We should be very grateful to the Federal Police for achieving what no one else could in getting the different tribes of the media all on the same page, in a way. Richard, we've got plenty of time. How do you define the public interest? How do you define the public interest? Was Barnaby's baby being declared? Was that in the public interest?
Very loose term that means different things to different people. It doesn't mean much to judges. They don't have a strong view of the public interest. They resent. I think there's a sort of cultural problem too with judges resenting journalism and publishers. The hostility you see in the courts quite frequently between, from judges about how dare you sort of publish this stuff. They think maybe journalists are trampling on their patch or something, but it's the whole idea of public interest in defamation is non-existent. There are some public interest offences under the new state security laws that were passed last 2018, the secrecy laws that criminalise the whistleblowers and the journalist reporting. There's a but it would be meaningless. I mean, once that gets into a court, nothing's in the public interest. State security is more important than the public interest. And I mean, it's sort of incredible in a way when you think that as far as defamation goes, which is a huge problem for the media, the amount of money that's spent on defending journalism is quite staggering, and the time and the resources that go into it. And yet in the United States, someone like Geoffrey Rush would not be able to bring a successful case. It would just be a First Amendment case. It'd be straight out the door. There's a very good reason why Harvey Weinstein hasn't sued the New York Times or the New Yorker. He wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Here, though, there's been plenty of Me Too type cases. I mean, Rush is a Me Too type case if you look at it. Like there was another one with that cricketer, Chris Gale. That was a Me Too type case. And they're all successful.
Richard, investigative journalism, is there a future?
There's got to be a future, because that is one of the important lifeblood elements of the modern media, the contemporary media, to explore, to expose, to ventilate, and to hold to account. That's an important thing, but it's not to say that other sort of journalism is less important. I mean, what we've seen with this constant attrition of staff and resources and the wearing down of newsrooms is, things like reporting of local councils and what civic society is doing, what the police rounds, what the police are doing, what other civic organisations are up to. The reporting of that is diminished, and this also has been a lifeblood of contemporary, news reporting, and it's going. I've got a young fellow that helps me at my work, and he also does, he's a university student, still at university, so he does some part-time interning at the Sydney Morning Herald. So he goes in, they give him a shift on a Sunday, and a couple of Sundays ago there were some big floods in Sydney. There was, Narrabeen lakes overflowed and people were having to be moved out and so on. So he said there's no one else in the newsroom. There's nothing. It's just him, young guy, not really a proper journalist at all, but he's sitting there. He's getting his stories on a Twitter feed. So he's looking for someone up at Narrabeen that can, make a comment. So he's looking through Twitter to find someone at Narrabeen so he can get a comment from. This is the way journalism works, for God's sake. And then the night editor said, well, maybe you should go up to Narrabeen and take a photo of this flooded lake, and that'd be nice to have in the paper. And I said, no, I can't leave my desk here because I'm monitoring the whole news for the paper, the news stories for the paper on Monday. I mean, this is what's happened to daily journalism. I mean, I'm not saying he's a wonderful person and very capable of doing it, but, where are the resources? And this is the tragic thing.
Can you answer your own question? Where is it? What is it going to look like? Take us ahead 5-10 years. What's it going to look like?
Yeah,
you write for a paper. Let's just make it clear here. You write for the Saturday paper. It's personally funded by someone who makes money out of property developing and then has a hobby of publishing news.
Mm.
So you get, the monthly and quarterly essay and Saturday paper from Maury Schwartz making money out of putting up buildings in Brunswick.
Well, I think a lot of things are cross-subsidised. I mean, every time I ask about how things work at the Saturday paper, I'm sort of shrouded in a sort of flow of mist, but
Oh, you just have to go to Lygon Street and hang out for long enough with Murray at...
But I mean, you know, the Australian was cross-subsidised for many years.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still the case, but...
Just go to Jimmy Watson's on Friday evening and you'll have it all explained to you.
So I think, you know, the platforms have obviously cannibalised a lot of the revenue from traditional journalism. And I was just telling Matthew earlier about this conference. There was a media conference in Austin, Texas. It was sort of illustrative of what's going on. So all the sort of big, heavy, you know, analysts and media writers are there, and the conference is downstairs in a big conference room. And in the morning, delegates coming out of their rooms, stepping over the local newspaper that's placed outside their door and looking at their phones to get the news as they go down to breakfast. I mean, this is what's happened. So no wonder there's no revenue.
Sure.
People aren't reading them.
My favourite ever media story, and it's very pertinent to this, is one that I think Richard Ackland told me years ago. And he's now so old he's probably even forgotten it himself. When Rupert Murdoch was but a lad, with one newspaper he'd inherited from his father in Adelaide, he was supervising the evening press rolling out, and he'd called the company's lawyer to check a terribly sensitive story that was on the front page. And as the papers came off the press, the lawyer picked it up and went, "Geez, Rupert, you can't print that." And Rupert slapped him down and said, and this is the greatest lesson you can learn, "You're my lawyer. It's not your job to tell me what I can or can't print. It's your job to tell me how much it might cost me if I do."
Well, there was a great story years ago when the Herald served an injunction from the High Court, the Sydney Morning Herald, to stop the presses, to stop the paper, because there was some defence documents that, you know, the Department of Defence didn't want published. And a process server, or it's probably a sheriff or some person like that from the High Court, came into the Herald building. The paper was already on the presses. And he said, "Well, how do I stop the presses? You know, what do I do?" He said, "Oh, well, you'll have to go down to the presses, and the night editor will be there. He'll be looking at the papers coming off the presses. So you can talk to him about what you do to stop the presses." So Peter Bowers, there's a fellow called Daffy Bowers, who's long gone, but a fabulous bloke. He was the night editor of the Herald. This bloke from the High Court comes down. So I've got an injunction here we woke a judge up in his pyjamas. We've got an injunction to stop this bloody paper going on the press. He said, "Well, you know, I can't hear you. The presses are roaring. You know, what are you saying?" He said, "I've got an injunction to stop the presses." "Well, where are you from?" I said, "Oh," he said, "I'm from the High Court." "Well, how do I know you're from the High Court? You know, so come upstairs, you know, come in, the paper's still madly coming off the press. Come on, we'll ring the High Court and find no one at the High Court, of course. Who gave you this bit of paper? So by the time all of this had happened, the paper was out and on the trucks and away. That's the way to deal with an injunction.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I think the thing is that what's happening is this sort of atomisation of the media. The old big mastheads that we used to rely on every day are getting weaker and poorer and less well-staffed and less well-resourced. And what's happening is the flowering of a myriad of online sources of news and information, which is much harder to aggregate and to have an effect. So if something really appalling happens that needs to be reported, there's less impact. And I think that is a problem. So I'm reasonably pessimistic. I think the situation is very dire, and for our well-being and our enlightenment and so on, I think it's unlikely to change under this government, or I would say under a Labor government, who in many ways are just as appalling.